Stan Lee was born on December 28, 1922, on West 98th Street and West End Avenue. His father, Jack Lieber, was a Romanian immigrant. His mother was born in New York. Lee has one younger brother, Larry Lieber. They were very poor since his father was a dress cutter in the Depression. He spent most of his time in the wanted ads. For Stan, it was a miracle that he got a bike for his birthday. When he was riding it, he could be whatever he imagined, like a knight in shining armor. He grew up in Manhattan, New York. He wrote obituaries for people. He quit because it was too depressing. Lee's talents focused in writing. When he heard that the company his cousin-in-law, Martin Goodman, was hiring for an assistant, Lee went to the interview not knowing it was for comics. He got the job because no one else applied. He worked only under two other people in the whole department of Timely Comics, which would later become Marvel. The two were Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. They worked there for about a year. Then Martin Goodman fired them. It is still a mystery to Stan as to why they were fired. Martin Goodman asked Stan to be the writer and editor until he found someone else. Stan used a pen named Stan Lee. His real name was Stanley Martin Lieber, but he shortened it to Stan Lee, so he could save his real name for the great American novel he would never write. Lee eventually went into the military during World War II in 1943 as a signal corps. Since he was enlisted as a playwright, he wrote stories for the troops. He worked with popular names such as Charles Adams, Frank Capra, William Sorora, and Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. When the war was over, Lee was set up on a blind date with a model. When he went to meet her, a different woman named Joan answered the door. Lee said that when he was a boy, he would try to draw his dream girl, and there she was. They married 6 weeks later, and are still married to this day. In the 1950s, comics were depicted as gruesome and horrific. It started when a German doctor named Frederick Wertham, who wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which targeted comic books. Churches would hold comic book burnings. Then in 1954, the Comic Code Authority was made. Their job was to regulate the amount of violence and sexuality in comics. Lee was a family man. In the 1950s, he had a daughter. Frustrated with the same stories after 20 years, in the 1960s, Lee told his wife he wanted to quit. Joan said, "Stan, why don't you do one book the way you want to do it?" So Stan came up with the Fantastic Four, Jack Kirby. After the Fantastic Four's success, Lee wrote another story and turned to artist Steve Ditko. They would come to write The Amazing Spider-Man. Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were Lee's main guys. Later, Lee and Kirby would come to create The Incredible Hulk, The Mighty Thor, The Invincible Iron Man, The X-Men. I can name these creations all day, but let's just say he created so many that there's an entire universe full of characters now. Lee and Kirby would eventually come to create the first African-American superhero, T'Challa. Lee's bravery in creating a black superhero at a critical time in history demonstrates the impact his writing had and its influence in society. In 1971, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare wrote a letter to Lee asking him to write a Spider-Man story to encourage kids not to do drugs. Since Spidey was such a positive influence on kids, Stan wrote a story showing Spider-Man saving a boy who was on drugs from falling off a roof. But the Comic Code would not approve of it because it mentioned drugs. Lee explained that it was an anti-drug story. The code still would not allow the book to be printed. Lee talked to his publisher, Martin Goodman, about publishing the Spider-Man anti-drug book without this code's authorization. Martin Goodman was with Lee 100%, and the book came out without the seal of approval. Doctors, parents, and teachers were mailing and calling Marvel about how they loved that book. After a week, the book came out. The Comic Code Authority had a meeting and rewrote the Comic Code to such an extent that it would no longer be the final authority over comics. Stan Lee's writing again was such a major influence in history. He was one of the first comic book writers to address such a controversial issue but powerful message. In the late 70s, Lee became head chairman of the company, but he later stepped down after a year because he wanted to be where the action was, writing. In 1989, Marvel was forced into bankruptcy, and everyone was let go. Lee moved on to Stan Lee Media. They started out well, then went into bankruptcy when they couldn't meet payroll. In 2001, Stan Lee made POW Entertainment. They specialize in all kinds of entertainment, such as animation and comics. At the age of 93, Lee is still writing today. Stan Lee once said, "I don't really see a need to retire as long as I'm having fun." Another quote from Lee is, "I used to be embarrassed because I was just a comic book writer, while other people were going on to building bridges or going on to medical careers. And then I began to realize entertainment is one of the most important things in people's lives. Without it, they might go off the deep end. I feel that if you're able to entertain people, you're doing a good thing." Like explorers who discovered new lands, Stan Lee created new characters who explored unknown areas of the universe, just like the Marvel Universe, which had a strong influence on young readers of comics who remained devoted followers into their adult lives. They became the new generation of writers, movie directors, actors, and moviegoers who were inspired by Lee's heroic characters. His characters represented the complex society of today. They had human imperfections as well as strength that people could relate to.
Good morning, Dr. Krensler. Security ought to be beefed up a lot more.
Welcome back to the Baxter, Dr. Richards. I've got the usual.
The technology of action
Good to
films
have
has
you back,
advanced
sir.
to the point that science fiction becomes reality on the movie screen. This makes the influence of the Marvel Universe very powerful.
You know, I guess one person can make a difference. Enough said.
Invitation, sir.
I should be on that list.
Name?
Stanley.
Yeah, nice try, buddy.
No,
Nice
no,
try.
really, I'm
Nice try.
Stanley.
Yeah. Look great, Hef.
A man drank one of those Guarana sodas. Guess it had
As
a little
people
more kick than he
encounter
was looking
new
for.
fears of annihilation due to threats of world wars and possible human extinction in real life, they can find hope in superheroes who seem to be able to survive any crisis.
Did it work?
Captain, that's your cue.
I thought he'd be taller.
Superheroes in New York? Give me a break.
Any questions?
With the exchange of Stan Lee's writings and now movies, Stan Lee's characters
Yeah.
influence not only
Can I have
people in
my
the
show
United
back?
States, but people in countries around the
As
world.
for you, now is your chance to do better. Why don't you see that you take it?
Thank you, sir.
Oh, man. I am so fired.
Thank you, true believers, for watching this incredible, fantastic, amazing documentary, Excelsior!
Where's your wife?
March along, march along, march along, march along to the Merry Marvel Marching Society.